So in the next 40 minutes or so, as we move through the discussion, I hope to cover the basics of polarity theory. I'll say a little bit about the history of it, how it blends both ancient thinking as well as some new thinking that the ancients didn't really have. Then I'll talk about how it relates to business. I mean, polarity management, as it's called, is a sort of a cottage industry within business consulting. And so that's one of the more pragmatic applications of this way of seeing things. And then I want to talk a little bit about how it relates to politics. So my next book, which is now in the publishing pipeline, it'll be out early next year, is called Developmental Politics: How America Can Grow into a Better Version of Itself. And that uses polarity theory in a variety of different ways, both a simple method, technology for dealing with conflict in politics, as well as a more elaborate philosophical understanding of how our political evolution can be aligned with the larger evolution of the universe. So, we're not ready to talk about the book today, but polarity theory makes a nice chunk that hopefully I'll be able to land here and people will find some value in it.
Okay.
And at the end, I'll talk about the cosmic implications of it. How, in other words, once we get how this is a feature, it's almost like the physics of value, if you'll pardon the term. Value has natural behaviors, and polarities is one of those. And so understanding where this pattern, this ubiquitous pattern of positive polarities, where that comes from. We're talking in abstract philosophical terms about values, dialectics and everything. But it does reach all the way down to the ground, and it's not just furniture for your mind. It's directly relevant in business and politics, and it has, I would argue, a spiritual teaching that goes with it. In other words, it points to larger truths about the universe that we can read right off of the basic behavior of value in the universe. Just like, you can see how electricity moves, and, if you're Maxwell, you could figure out how that light and magnetism are part of the same spectrum. And while that's highly rarefied mathematical physics, it leads directly to extremely powerful technologies that change the world forever. So polarity system management, working with polarities as systems of development, is a technology unto itself, a kind of a value technology that many have found useful. So the basics of the theory are that dichotomies, pairs of things are so ubiquitous in human experience that they're almost prosaic, hot and cold, up and down, in and out. I mean, just any kind of difference, you could point to two ends of a continuum, and that might be confused for a polarity, and maybe, by some definitions it would be, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about common, everyday, this and that. There are other kinds of oppositions that are bound together that are straightforwardly good and bad, right? Good and bad itself, right? But that also might be related to prosperity and poverty, right? Those prosperity is, for the most part, as long as it's achieved ethically, an alloyed good, right? And poverty is something that I believe that one day we'll be able to overcome it. It's certainly been overcome in some parts of the world. So we can look at anytime we encounter linked pairs, that whereas one is unambiguously good and the other is unambiguously bad, it's a problem to be solved, right? So it's something that hopefully it may take a long time, or it may take, may be able to done instantly. But the idea is to just, the good should triumph and the bad should fall. But there's a rarer and of course more significant kind of relationship of two pairs that are bound to each other and co-create each other. They're interdependent. And these are positive polarities. So, they're not negative or positive, they're positive. And that means that these relationships are indestructible. They continue to appear. You can't just sort of declare victory of one over the other. So to be specific, to start with a polarity that is exemplary of this positive relationship, I can cite liberty and equality. Right, so the French Revolution, right? Their rallying cry was liberty, equality, fraternity. And since then, liberty and equality, the balance between those two in political philosophy, has animated political philosophy in many different quarters. In other words, the idea that obviously we want equality, But if we're gonna have total equality, then we're gonna have to take away liberty. The only way to get equality absolutely is to have, zero or very little liberty. Likewise, if we just focus on liberty, then equality is going to take a hit. We want to try to balance these two, but we can't just sort of say, well, we want both and we're going to just have both, because they challenge each other. In other words, that there's an existential opposition between liberty and equality because one cancels the other at the extreme. And so rather than try to say that these things should just be included in a both and way, I mean, certainly we want both and, but because there's that indestructible dynamic tension between these two principles or two forms of value creation, or two principles of liberty or political value, however you want to talk about it, liberty and equality are, they continue to recur. We continue to know deep in our bones that equality is something we should strive for, and that one of the ways we can make the world a better place is to bring about greater equality, greater fairness, greater justice, all of the things that go on that side of the polarity. But we've also seen in history how when the group will is emphasized and the individual is quashed, or the individual's rights are taken away, that leads to a kind of pathology, right? No matter how good equality can be, equality by itself, if it's not challenged and moderated by the opposing pole of liberty, then either one of these can become pathological without the other. So the kind of the principle underlying this is that values and things that create value, or sort of anything to do with positive creativity, making things better, right? That one of the behaviors of this thing we call value, think of it like electricity, like a form of power and light, that this force in the universe, which is a perfecting force, I like to think of value in its most abstract and absolute terms as the beautiful, the true, and the good, right? So those are sort of the primary values, like primary colors. But in the world, the beautiful, the true, and the good inform all these different kinds of sub-values like liberty and equality. Let me mention a few others to just sort of round out. I've got a list of 12 here that I can point to. So that sort of the foremost kind of one of the master polarities that anchor this understanding is individual and community, right? I mean, that relates. Everyone has this theme of a part and a whole. And the whole needs the part, and the part needs the whole, and they kind of go back and forth. So individual and community is certainly an expression of a positive polarity. Liberty and equality, I mentioned. We could also mention real and ideal, right? In other words, if you're completely idealistic and it doesn't relate to reality, that's not going to create much value. But likewise, if you're a total realist and you have no ideals, you don't have any hope for transcendence, that becomes pathological too. So ideally, the real and the ideal, that's a principle that you can apply to just about any situation you find yourself in. If you find yourself being too idealistic or too realistic, it's good to allow the polar counterpart of that value-creating approach to work together, like two legs, that you're making progress. Another one that is particularly eye-opening for people who are postmodern is competition cooperation. In postmodern circles, cooperation is good, competition is bad. I mean, according to many people's lights. And that's sort of understandable because postmodernism is trying to push off against modernity, right? It's trying to overcome the pathologies of modernity. And because modernity is hyper-individualistic and competition is one of the ways that it creates value, right? Freedom, free markets, the economic value that it creates, a lot of it comes from competition. So because it's emphasizing competition over cooperation in sometimes pathological expressions, the natural remedy to that is to embrace cooperation at all costs. But if it's true that competition and cooperation are an indestructible pair that go together and need each other, that they're interdependent, that in order to get the full value of cooperation, as a value-creating approach to things, you have to allow some room for individual excellence, right? Otherwise, you get groupthink and sort of stifling mediocrity. Likewise, competition by itself becomes, dog eat dog, and everybody gets defensive, and it becomes pathological. But when the two are allowed to be in a relationship of challenge and support, right? I think I may have mentioned that. That's another polarity unto itself. So challenge and support is a description of the ideal relationship between the poles. So, for example, in parenting, right? If you're a super harsh tiger mother and all you do is challenge your kids, I'm not sure that's the best approach. But if you're a total softie and you never ask anything of them and you just spoil them, that's not going to be ideal either. So in parenting or managing people in your company or whatever it is, if you're working with people in a nurturing capacity, but you want them to strive for excellence, invoking and keeping in mind and indeed practicing this value technology of challenge and support is an important pragmatic approach to these philosophical ideas. I can mention a few others: relative and absolute, defensive and offensive, simplicity, complexity, immanent, transcendent. And one that I kind of just recently have been thinking a lot about is the polarity of grievance and gratitude. It's got a nice alliteration to it, right? So here, the idea is that grievance, right, in political grievances or cultural grievances, social grievances, anytime you're speaking truth to power or otherwise asking for things to be better within a system where it's possible to be better, you're not just a completely oppressed victim, you have a voice and you have an opportunity to make things better, then that grievance is going to be most effective as a value generating activity when it has some connection, is informed by gratitude. In other words, being part of Western civilization, if you'll pardon the term, I mean, I'm very grateful for it, even though, in many ways it sucks and, we have this horrible president and, there's plenty of real grievances that the average person has, multiple grievances, and those grievances are worth making. But I would contend that polarity theory suggests that this value-creating activity of protesting and expressing grievances, if you can connect it to gratitude, then you're going to be far more persuasive. Your rhetoric's going to be much more powerful if you can connect the part with the whole in a recursive circuit whereby, there's challenge and support between the two. I think of some of the most bitter opponents, some of the most bitter green people. I think how much more politically effective could they be if they just acknowledged for a moment that they were grateful to be part of, a civilization where, we have political freedoms, freedom of speech. You can make a grievance. Okay, that you should be grateful for your grievances. Anyway, I don't want to get too carried away on that, but it's worth thinking about. And I think about it a lot when I read something, some op-ed, and I read about a grievance, and I think about what that person should be grateful for. When the opposite. When people are just so patriotic or so grateful or so uncritical, right? That's a form of pathology as well. Obviously, we don't want to just settle for the status quo. We know things can be better and we need to demand it. But in this container wherein the value creating capacity of our demands can be maximized. And the perhaps, one of the prime polarities is masculine and feminine. And masculine and feminine is a good one to bring up, even though, everyone, regardless of their gender, in a sense, embodies that polarity to a degree. And obviously, both are value creating, both are sacred in their own way. And while, there's certain circumstances where one pole by itself is best left alone by the other, in the scheme of things, gradually, I would say that those two are interdependent. I mean, not just for reproductive fecundity, but for happiness, in our spiritual journey. So polarity theory, originates, of course, thousands of years ago in the ancient understanding, both East and West. Contemporaneously, it was sort of discovered. Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, however you want to say his name, the ancient Chinese sage and one of the founders of Taoism, right? The famous yin-yang symbol is in some ways a very important expression of the interdependence of polarities. And people are familiar with the yin-yang symbol. At the heart of the black wave is the white dot, and vice versa. And that's illustrating in a very graphic and beautiful way, the interdependence of the polarities. Around the same time that Lao Tzu had his realizations about the way the opposites create the world, Heraclitus, or Heraclitus, however you want to say his name, the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher, also developed a philosophy of opposites and polarities. And then in medieval Europe, Nicholas of Cusa, sort of independently, I'm not sure how much he was influenced by Heraclitus, but he certainly wasn't influenced by Lao Tzu. But he developed a philosophy of the coincidence of opposites, he called it, and was noticing how these things fit together and co-create each other. However, this ancient understanding of, for example, yin and yang being in some ways the most powerful expression of what we're talking about, there's something about it which is not as powerful as modern polarity theory, because modern polarity theory brings in another phase of understanding that, in a sense, goes beyond the ancient understanding. And so this comes, interestingly enough, from business academia, right? Beginning in the 1980s, intellectual writers in business and Harvard Business Review and people like that began to realize that in businesses, there were these permanently recurring, indestructible features. And while sometimes they made the connection between masculine and feminine, or yin and yang, in other ways they realized that that's not, that taking a Taoist view of the opposites and thinking about it in terms of yin and yang, it can lead you into thinking that these are equals seeking equipoise, or two sides that are absolutely equal, and that they're seeking harmony between the two, right? And that's certainly true of the masculine and feminine polarity. But the dynamism comes in when we recognize that every one of these polarities, the part that the modern theory added to the ancient theory, was that the motif isn't of a yin and yang as perfectly symmetrical opposites. It's more of the motif of part and whole, right? So liberty is about the part. It's about the individual, right? Equality is about the whole, right? Competition is about the part. Cooperation is about the whole, right? That is, support is about the individual. Challenge is about the whole, right? So you can find this motif of part and whole expressed in one way or another wherever you find this positive polarity. And that's sort of the key to its dynamism. That's how it's sort of these polarities are value creating engines, because they're not stable. They're not equals symmetrically seeking harmony. They're part and whole seeking integration. And that integration is ongoing, right? So the impetus, the eros of the part, is to differentiate. The eros of the whole is to integrate. But if you once the whole has integrated, if you just stop, then evolution stops. The impetus of the part to break out of that stifling whole in quest of a new, larger whole is part of how this part and the whole motif of value creation acts as two legs, in one after the other, right? So it's this continuous process. And when evolution was first realized in the 19th century, Herbert Spencer, who's a villain in his own right, but he certainly added a lot to thinking about evolution. And he described it as a process of differentiation followed by integration. And so that's why that overall characterization of evolution, polarities as part and whole seeking continuous movement, by integrating and differentiating, is a great way of tying it in with this larger evolutionary pattern, right? And that also hints at this dialectic of development, but we'll come to that in a moment. So when working with polarities, there are three fallacies that are really important to understand. And so these fallacies, I want to credit Charles Johnston, MD, who's written a series of books. And his book from 1990 called Necessary Wisdom has an elaborate teaching on these fallacies and how it's so easy to fall into them. And I learned a lot of that. So, shout out to Charles Johnston. I should also say that a lot of the business thinking from the 80s and that's contributed to this has been distilled and popularized effectively by Barry Johnson, who is the most successful popularizer of polarity theory, even though the theory itself can be traced back to earlier sources. So, hats off to Barry for helping put this truth out there. So the fallacies are, just separation fallacies, unity fallacies, and compromise fallacies, right? So a unity fallacy, which you see a lot with people who have a postmodern center of gravity, green center of gravity, is to always side with the whole, to always side with the yin aspect, to just reflexively When you're faced with a polarity, of course you choose cooperation over competition. The masculine side, or the agentic, individualistic side, is it's just sort of distasteful to people who are prone to these unity fallacies. Likewise, separation fallacies are the opposite, right? The sort of reductionistic scientific way of thinking that wants to sort of analyze things into parts and misses the forest for the trees, if you'll pardon the cliche. That's a classic separation fallacy. And so people who are modernists have to guard mostly against separation fallacies and being reductionistic. People who are postmodernists have to be aware, if they want to use this technology, of how their knee-jerk reaction is to side with the feminine. And that's not always bad, but sometimes absolutely. If you think about it as two legs, sometimes the right leg is the one you want to put forward, right? But eventually you need the left leg as well. The compromise fallacy, and this is really well illuminated by Johnston, is where you try to just say both and in a static way, right? Instead of allowing the two to be in permanent challenge and support, you want to just bring them to rest, like it's all good. They're both true, and that's that, right? Or these are just different paths to the top of the mountain. But what that does is it sort of changes what is otherwise a whole array of creative colors that are possible when the two are integrated into shades of gray, right? It's just we just have to sort of bring the two together, and if one is black and the other is white, we're going to have gray, and that eliminates the creative potentials that go when you allow for the tension to be indestructible, when you recognize that the tension is indestructible. Even though one may prevail temporarily, the other, always needs to come back. You always need to have the situation challenged, because in an evolving universe, to be static is to ultimately regress. So we want to keep walking. It's like walking on a bog. If you stand still, you sink in, right? But if you keep going, you can progress across the top of this messy world. So, the fallacies are part of the practice, right? So you're looking, as in terms of the practice, you're looking for an opportunity to create value. And whatever you're doing in the world to make something good or make something better, it's good to check in philosophically with yourself and say, are there any positive polarities implicated here? I mean, there almost always are. Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, is famous for saying that the opposite of a small truth is a falsehood, but the opposite of a great truth is another great truth. And so an example there would be, a great spiritual truth is that we're all one, right? That there's sort of the non-dual reality of oneness in the universe means that we're all part of the same thing. We're all different expressions of the same thing. Oneness in all its different phrases, emptiness, there's all kinds of ways of conceiving of what this is theologically or philosophically. But that's clearly, if you will deny that oneness is a very powerful spiritual truth. But the opposite of that truth is that not only are we all one, we're also all original. There's nobody else like you, right? There's only one Miles, there's only one Steve, and the people who know us know that we do have that originality, and that's a very important part of our spiritual sovereignty. Our free will is associated with our originality, and so that's a great truth that they're both true, even though they seem to contradict each other. They're kind of a koan, right? Like all these are to a degree. So in business, this cottage industry that's developed recognizes that when businesses are trying to create value, there's almost always you can find a connection between the two major functions of business, which are building and protecting, right? So obviously the marketing and sales are building, right? And accounting and legal are protecting. And clearly, if the business lacks either, it's unlikely to succeed. Right? You can't just let the accountants run things, but if you let the salespeople go crazy, then you're not going to be profitable. So these two functions are in opposition to each other, clearly, and if one tends to dominate or vanquish the other, then pathology will be the result. So they need each other in this challenge and support relationship. And so part of the business consulting that goes with this practice in business, one of the things that Barry Johnson uses is he draws a polarity chart. So he makes a four-quadrant model, and then he writes down his procedure is to write down the positives, so building on one side, protecting on the other, the two goods that come from that positive polarity. And then in the lower quadrant, so the pathologies that naturally go with the goods. In other words, accounting can, be penny pinching or, stepping over dollars, looking for dimes. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we could write down the negatives of being too tight in the business. Mm-hmm. Likewise, that sales will promise anything just to get the sale, right? I mean, these business examples are somewhat prosaic, but they at least make it pragmatic and practical and give you an idea how managers and business leaders find this process. They have, some of them have, my friend Bert Parley, who some of you know, he has a whiteboard, a grease board, that has the 4-square polarity chart printed on it. So he just writes in and then they erase. And so they use this polarity chart over and over again as a way of analyzing problems in a business. And the principle being not only the challenge and support, that the two need to be in this deliberative container where they get to challenge and support each other. There's also the idea that the positives of one are a perfect remedy for the negatives of the other, right? So you have this downward diagonal comparison where that is, you try to apply the upsides to the downsides, and it's a recursive process of going around and around. Mm. And people who are interested in polarity management, which is a trademarked name of Barry Johnson's business, they can look him up on the internet. And there's a whole, like I said, a cottage industry of people who are working with the principles of polarity management to do business consulting and help businesses create value in more positive ways by applying this very pragmatic, stepwise approach. Now, in politics, polarity theory is extremely relevant. And that's part of like I said at the beginning, that's part of what's animated my forthcoming book, Developmental Politics. I try to bring in this understanding of polarities. So, for example, in the United States, we have, of course, modernity, which has a right side and a left side. And you have postmodernism, which is almost all left. And you have traditional worldview, which is almost all on the right. I mean, there's some exceptions, but we can see how, social conservatives and traditional religionists are almost always on the right, and postmodernists, progressives almost always vote on the left politically. Modernity is sort of split down the middle, maybe 60-40. They're sort of the liberal modernists who are not willing to go all the way with the postmodernists. They're influenced by postmodernism for sure, but they still believe in, capitalism and liberal values. And then you have conservative modernists as well, or more libertarians or fiscal conservatives. So not only can we see an overarching polarity between the left and the right, we can also see that the polarity is within the left and the right. So there's a polarity between fiscally conservative modernists and socially conservative traditionalists. That's a strong polarity, and that can disintegrate the right, as we've seen. Likewise, now we can see a strong polarity developing on the left between the postmodernists, who are now gaining a little bit of political power. They have immense cultural power, but for a long time, that politically they were for people who are in America, the most visible postmodern politician was Dennis Kucinich, right? And Bernie Sanders was there in the Senate, but he didn't have a national profile. Now, of course, we have Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a whole host of powerful politicians who are authentically postmodern, postmodern in their center of gravity culturally. So this is a significant development, but of course it's roiling the Democratic Party, and the question of whether this polarity is going to disintegrate the political effectiveness of the left in a way that they're not able to overcome Trump is it's a big question. But understanding not only that there's a polarity across and polarity within these levels, it's also important to see how the polarities are part of what create the values. In other words, postmodern values are formed by the problems with modernity and traditionalism. Right? They're pushing off against the pathologies of modernity and traditionalism. So the polarity, that polar relationship, is part of how the value is being created. Right? So you don't want to just eliminate the polarity. You want to make it move from a stuck polarity, where they're at each other's throats, to a generative polarity, where there's a recognition of how polarities themselves create value, and there could be a deliberative container, or a truce, where you're not trying to eliminate. It's not like we're all going to just meet in the middle, right? That's why centrism fails, because it doesn't take account, or at least in this day and age, doesn't take account of these intense polar forces that are like strong currents, strong dialectical currents that are pulling people to one side or another. So the political solution is not to try to eliminate that tension, but to try to create a bigger container. That's what integral politics or developmental politics does, is it shows how all these parts of our political spectrum have both positive values that we need to carry forward, right? Traditionalism, for all its racism and bigotry and xenophobia and all the negative stuff that's so easy to see in traditionalism, those pathologies are associated with foundational values that are absolutely necessary for the continuation of our civilization, right? We may have transcended traditional culture. We don't have to go to church to be able to appreciate how decency, honesty, respect for rightful authority, recognition of the sacredness of the family, patriotism, mild, international, but still a degree of relative patriotism. These are all very important traditional values that we need as the foundation of the whole hierarchical structure of our civilization, right?
They're good, true, and beautiful within and of themselves.
Right, but the only way to see their true good and beautifulness, or their beauty and truth and their goodness, is to tease apart, right, the dignities from the disasters, the pathologies from the associated scaffolding of evolution that was there because they had to deal with the level below, right? Dealing with egocentric red consciousness is a tough job. And so naturally, you're going to be negatively configured by that job, which traditionalism certainly has. But when we begin to see that traditionalism, modernity, both in its liberal and conservative expressions, and postmodernism all have very important bedrock values that we need going forward. And yet each one of these political positions identified by these polarities that we can see evidently also have, each one has a set of negatives that go with it. So part of the practice of polarities in politics is when you're working with your opponents or dealing with people on the other side, whether it be the other side of the aisle over together, or even within the left, right? Postmodern versus modernist left, is to the principle that I try to describe is when you're faced with a positive polarity, that we really teased away all the negatives and you're dealing with two goods, positive and a positive. The best way to forward the values of your preferred pole is to affirm the values of the pole you oppose. In other words, by bringing the values, by bringing people, by showing that you value their values as well, even though your main goal is to try to eliminate their pathologies. Again, it's sort of like grievance and gratitude, right? It's sort of by bringing in those values and making them part of who you are, because they are. If you're a postmodernist, you didn't get there without traditional values and modernist values. You're using those whether you affirm it or not. So by affirming it, that's the first step in creating this deliberative truce, or this relational container, wherein the process of challenge and support can take place, right? So this is an elaborate description of a political method, which I talk about in the book, and I can only talk about so much here. But in my last 5 minutes before questions, let me move to the more cosmic dimensions of why this pattern keeps appearing, right? Why do we consistently, almost consistently find that wherever we find something that's creating value and that's a positive principle, that there's a complementary but challenging principle that goes with it. Again, this philosophy is fairly new in terms of its entry into an analysis by an integral perspective, and there's a lot more work to be done in unpacking, the parameters of how far these principles go. But I think we have a solid purchase on the fact that the polarities are real, that they're a subset of this larger dialectical relationship, and that they're a kind of a little engine of evolution, that if we can understand it philosophically, we can use that philosophical understanding to make powerful technologies for politics and business and life and growth and all that other stuff. So why is it? Why is there this pattern? I think that in some ways that the way value behaves in the universe is a little bit like there's a fractal representation of the whole. So every one of these value polarities is a little miniature model, right? Like a fractal Mandelbrot set within the larger Mandelbrot set. And of the master polarity, which could be labeled in a variety of ways, but I can label it as infinite and finite, right? So the infinite, of course, is eternal, existential, universal, and we have finite minds, so we can only, We can know it's there. We can have faith. We can experience its ultimacy. But
Mhm.
ultimately, we live here in the finite universe, so we have to kind of, chop wood and carry water as well. So
Right.
as we're doing that, we can recognize that in some ways, the evolution itself is the polarity management of the universe. So 13.8 billion years ago, with the Big Bang, our universe, the universe of time and space and matter and energy, it became a part of the infinite universe. The infinite's still there. Again, we have to use sort of analogies. We can talk about things and in this way, and it quickly becomes paradoxical or nonsensical. But treating it lightly, we have this realm of time and space where, in a sense, infinity's been partially removed. Time. When you take away eternity, you have time. When you take away infinity, you get space. Right? When you take away the sort of the existential goodness of everything, you have a space where things can actually be made better. And we, as agents of evolution, can participate in that process of making things better because things are incomplete. Right? That we're in time. We're in this imperfect universe, even though we can always gain the infinite perspective and say things are perfect. Things are already as they should be from an infinite perspective. But here in the finite, we live in a world of trouble and suffering. And I would say that those of us who can have a duty to try to alleviate, the suffering and trouble in this world. So working with value, creating value, perfecting the universe, not that we can perfect ourselves or maybe even our world, but we can certainly make it better. We can make it more beautiful, true, and good. And even though there have been plenty of regressions and plenty of horrific things that have occurred in the process of our ascent, like Wilbur's book title, Up from Eden, really shows we are on an upward trajectory of value. Things are, we are gaining in consciousness. We are gaining in unity and complexity and all the different ways that evolution makes something more keeps coming from something less. And that something more evolves through this process whereby there's a transcendence, right? I mentioned at the beginning, transcending and including. There's another way of talking about the dialectic, right? So professional philosophers and dialecticians, they hate the construct thesis, antithesis, synthesis. They rail against it, right? That's their pet peeve.
That's
so
interesting. Why?
Podcast like this, we try to simplify it and use those terms. It's like
Sure.
nails on a chalkboard for these guys, right? So let me just acknowledge that. Hegel rarely talk. Hegel, Fichte, the idealist philosophers in Germany, they rarely use the construct thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But so Hegel talked about it in terms of a condition, an affirmation, which is then broken out of by a negation. Something says no, or that's not good enough. And so then there's the affirmation, the negation, and then what he called the negation of the negation, right? Which is the synthesis, right? Stated in positive terms, whereby the best of both are carried forward. And again, it's a slippery philosophy. But this process of transcending and including, when you look at how the structure it creates, the holarchy of levels, that the levels themselves are in a polar relationship. I mentioned the politics of traditionalism and modernism and postmodernism. There's a positive polarity that's at the nub of the transcendence between the two. And so being able to see that there's this universal pattern of evolution as a whole. So infinite is the whole, right? Finite is the part. And the integration of the two is evolution itself, right? That's why evolution is the movement of the dialectic. The beautiful, the true, and the good are the directions of evolution. And these value-creating processes is how every little instance of positive creativity is a fractal mirror of the entire process of the universe creating positive creativity in, the unfolding evolution that we're part of. So that looks like at about time. Again, I'd love to go on about all this stuff. But I wanted to kind of fit it into a bite-sized chunk, and that's perhaps
bite-sized, yeah, just barely bite. But why do traditional philosophers? Why is it like nails on chalkboard for them?
Well, part of it is because it's oversimplified. It's a flowing process, and so they think it's kind of clunky. Step was step one, followed by step two, followed by step three. Sometimes if the polarities are indestructible, then it's not as if the synthesis just leaves these polarities behind. right?
Right.
In other words,
Right.
there's a way in which it's a very complex process, and it's a fluid
Sure.
process, and it's a process that can't be. It's like the horse running. There's a fluidity to the way the horse runs, and if you take a photograph of it, you can see the legs in different positions, but that you're not getting the run expressed by the still photos. And that's another point I can make is that because they're always challenging and supporting, that as the part breaks out of the whole and then there's a new process of integration where there's a larger whole, it's continuous. And so, the snapshot robs of its dynamic fluidity is at least one of the objections I can cite.
Sure. But onward moves evolution, because even when there's a greater whole, it goes through the same process again eventually. Or as you said,
it's a new affirmation requiring a new negation. Yeah.
Right. Well, Steve, can I ask you about the three fallacies? And I want to open it up also for other people who may have questions. You can either type a question into the chat box, or you can, if you go below, click on the Manage Participants button in the chat button, you'll see a way to raise your hand. If you raise your hand, we will bring you in. In the meantime, you spoke about the three fallacies.
Yes, from Charles Johnston. Just want to make sure credit him on that.
Great. Yes, the separation fallacy, unity fallacy, and the compromise fallacy. And it occurs to me that this whole idea of polarity theory, I mean, it's very common, especially in the political landscape, that one pole tries to squelch, if not run away from, but usually squelch or dominate.
Vilify. See it only for the bad.
Right, exactly. So that would be the separation fallacy.
Well, no, because if you're siding with separation fallacy and unity fallacies are both one side dissing the other.
Exactly.
Right? So a separation fallacy is to go for the part and declare the tyranny of the whole, or the other is to go with the whole and declare that the part is rebellious and needs to be quashed.
And the third one, the cooperation fallacy,
is to try to eliminate the dynamism to make
moving to the middle,
static, right? So they're just the same, and to deny the conflict, to deny the existential challenge that one has to the other, to pretend that conflict isn't there.
And then you lose the energy of the poles. You lose the dynamism.
Right. The system collapses and becomes static.
Right. So here's my question. So just on a human level, or even a collective level, which I guess is an individual or collective level, why do we do that in the first place? Because as an Aikido teacher, whenever we come into conflict with another person in any way, energetically, everything in the system, from our biological survival instincts, everything in this system wants to close down, doesn't want to stay open to the dialectic, but rather we go into zero-sum relationship to the other. So why do we do this in the first place?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I would say there's a variety of different answers that all kind of converge. I mean, so one answer would be that's part of the limitations of first-tier worldviews, is that they see the other worldviews only for their pathologies. There's an either-or binary. Without this sort of integral or dialectical consciousness, you can't see. Robert Keegan, the famous developmental psychologist, he's got a great quote where he says that dialectical thinking is the ability to see conflict as the over-identification with one element of the system.
That's so great.
So, in other words, when there's a conflict that it seems like a permanent conflict, like green is bad or orange is bad, then that you're over-identifying with one part of a dynamic system. And dialectical thinking or integral consciousness, I mean, they're not entirely synonymous, but they're certainly related. That this is the ability to see these things, to take a larger view that can see how these two seemingly opposing systems or principles or whatever you want to, however they fit, how they work together to create something larger. And that ideally you want to preserve both while continuously pruning away the pathologies of each.
So it's the ability to see conflict as a dialectic at that point.
Right. In other words, to recognize that if you find conflict, then there's a good chance that the conflict itself is a perception that's based on the over-identification with one part of a polar system.
Right.
And those fallacies are illustrative of that.
Beautiful. Well, okay. So once again, I've got another question for you. But once again, I want to open it up to the room. If anybody does have any questions for Steve and his talk on polarity theory, raise your hands. I'm going to see if anybody's. I don't see if you're raising your hand physically. I probably won't see it. The bottom of the screen, click a management participant or chats, and you'll get an electronic button to raise your hand. Yeah, you had mentioned, kind of in passing, but you had mentioned about, I believe you were speaking about the individual and the collective and how the individual is more about free will.
Well,
So,
the individual, that's what, the difference between a group and an individual. The group can have will in a way, it can have a
right, yeah,
collective intention that's an intersubjective entity with its own, momentum. But the individual has a sovereignty. I mean, we have a sensitive center, right? We have a moral imperative to be good people. At least I would argue,
yeah,
and the ability to choose right from wrong requires free will, right? That's the whole
right,
principle of the law. Is if you couldn't have done otherwise, you're not guilty. Right?
exactly.
It's only if you have a choice that you could be authentically held to have a moral responsibility or a legal responsibility. And so that's why free will is absolutely necessary. I would even argue that free will is an organ of perception for value. Because you
Okay,
can't.
well, here we go. So this is where I wanted to ask you about free will. I want to kind of extract it a little bit
Yeah.
from the individual collective, but what about free will versus determinism? Now, would you say that's a positive polarity, or because it is an issue these days? There's a lot of people speaking. I have my own take on that, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'd have to give that some thought. I don't know. I mean, I think of free will as a spiritual superpower that makes
Yeah,
us spiritual creatures. So I
right.
wouldn't want to put it in an equal and opposite relationship with determinism. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
certainly we could say matter and spirit, that matter is the part and spirit is the whole. I mean, we could sort of find our way if we were to discuss it and parse it into whatever it is the right word for determinism that might match up with free will as a positive polarity. Another
Right.
way of thinking about it is, for example, that we as free will creatures, at least some of the time, that we have to struggle between two different kinds of determinism, right? The part is physical determinism, biological determinism, the determinism of matter,
Matter, right?
right? We're
Exactly.
totally
Yes.
controlled by our minds.
For 13.8 billion years, it's just moving. That's
Right,
determined.
right. And
Yeah.
now, of course, there's a huge amount of cultural determinism, right? These worldviews think our thoughts for us, right? And that is, it's hard for most people to break out of the cultural container in which they find themselves in. So much of our consciousness is determined by these larger forces. But
Right.
in between the upward determinism of physicality and the downward determinism of intersubjectivity, I would argue, there's a tiny opening, right? That's where we have our freedom. And
Yes.
as Abraham Maslow taught, the more self-actualized you are, the more free will you have, that your free will
Right.
grows, that opening expands as you develop and grow spiritually.
Yeah, and that's interesting because for example, Sam Harris, who I adore, I follow his podcast as well. I like Sam Harris, but he falls on the material science side of free will, that there is no free will, that it's just deterministic. And yet, from my own Buddhist practice, I mean, I think your spiritual practice is of the Christian faith.
I'm not a Christian, no, but
Okay. Okay.
the love of God, yeah.
Okay, great. The love of God, fine. So, but it was from day one. It was like, no, free will is what's going to get you through this, and there was no confusion about that.
Right. Well, in some ways, if you're Sam Harris and you want to try to argue for a material worldview, no matter how nuanced his materialism may be, you free will undoes it. Free will, like I said, is a spiritual superpower. If there's free will, that vanquishes materialism, so they have to deny it or weasel around it like Daniel Dennett does, right? And sort of say, well, yeah, for practical purposes, but in cosmic terms, no. There can't be freedom because everything's just physical. And freedom is, in a sense, a spiritual idea from start to finish. So I would say that, first of all, he has to. But it's also, like Whitehead said, the scientists with the purpose of showing that there's no purpose is a very interesting phenomenon. Every day.
Say that again.
In other words, scientists who have a strong purpose to show that there's no purpose in the universe is an interesting phenomenon. And so Sam Harris is one of the most purposeful persons in the world, writing books, being a cultural, luminary. Every day he gets up and he demonstrates tremendous purpose, and yet there's no purpose or it's an illusion, and that, we got to find the humor in that.
Indeed. Well, my own experience with this comes, other than just thinking about it and actually feeling it in my own, is in the meditation practice I've done, where in some of the Vipassana is the tradition I practice, and at some point in the advanced trainings of Vipassana, you make what are called adhitanas, determinations, You sit, you make a determination to have a certain experience, to go into a certain state, and then you let it go. And after your mind has been trained, you've trained your mind for, months and months and months on end on the cushion. You let it go, and then these experiences seem to happen, and they happen in a way that is not deterministic. They wouldn't happen if you didn't have the intention. If you hold the intention, they also won't happen because the ego's in there, has an agenda. They have to be completely let go, but then they happen. And for me, that's the fine point where they say that, that free will actually is something you apply, but you can't, the agent has to somehow let go for free will.
Sure. I mean, free will itself is a paradoxical condition. I mean,
Yes.
and it's something, I'm declaring it with force here in this conversation, but there's all kinds of nuances. We could spend many hours talking about the nuances of free will. And my favorite Buddhist, Thich Nhat Hanh, has valiantly affirmed free will. I mean, even though it sort of leads to a self and a soul, and it's a slippery slope if you're trying to be a strict Buddhist. But he says, look, we can control our actions, we can choose our dharma. We're not just thoroughly determined. And his teaching about free will in the context of emptiness and interbeing, as he calls it, is very beautiful. I've learned a lot from it, and I could recommend people Google Thich Nhat Hanh and free will.
Well, let's go to Tiffany. Tiffany wrote here in the chat box. She says, "Is there possibility for free will when morality has traditionally been upheld by fear and violence? Can we reach free will individually, or will it need to be a collective endeavor?"
Well, free will comes from the individual. It's a sovereign capacity of what we have a sensitive center. We have this ability to choose. We're moral agents. These are elements of what it means to be an individual, right, as opposed to just a group, which may not have, certainly doesn't have the same self-aware kind of consciousness. In the face of fear, I mean, fear is part of the human condition. It's part of what we're trying to evolve out of. A lot of the fear that we see in the world. I mentioned traditionalism, all the negativity that goes with that worldview, is scaffolding that was put up to try to build the building of civilization in the face of red or egocentric warring gangs and egocentric consciousness that rapes and pillages and is very gnarly. You have to try to civilize that. And it's fear of that in a sense brings about the traditional values. At least that's one of the catalysts for it. And then of course the oppression of traditionalism, the fear and loathing that go with that, right? The medieval world, we have to try to break out of that. So each emergence, each episode of transcendence is a way of using our free will to overcome, the fear that's generated from the previous levels attempt to deal with the free will run riot of the previous level. So, it's a dialectical, stepwise process whereby these two legs are needing each other to make the journey.
And when that goes to an extreme, it becomes the problem that gets solved that needs to be pushed off at the next vertical stage.
Right. And so being able to see the pathologies in the context of the dignities or the positives, that's part of this dialectical seeing that is the major strength of integral consciousness to begin with.
Oh, beautiful.